Hello, and welcome to the Marble Security Podcast. I'm recording on June 20th, 2014, from Sunnyvale, California. Today we're going to be discussing the new Marble Labs Mobile Threat Report, where we look at the threats between iOS applications and Android applications, and the broader platform threats. The report can be found on the Marble Security website at www.marblesecurity.com. For this report, what we did was analyze the threat behavior of approximately 1 million apps on both iOS and Android, and we looked at their behavior, what they're doing, what data they're accessing, whether they're trying to jailbreak phones or not, whether they are sending data off the device, primarily to look at them from a threat perspective for the enterprise. Let me first say that the core platforms of iOS and Android, in my opinion, are inherently about the same as far as security goes. What is different is the environment that they operate in. So primarily, that's a more constrained environment in Apple's case, where for an unjailbroken phone or iPad, you can only download apps from one place, and that's the App Store. And there's a level of vetting that goes on there to get apps onto it. Whereas on Android, it's a much more open platform, and it's much easier for people to go and download apps from Amazon or a plethora of app stores. Really easy to sideload apps on it as well. And that might be fine for a consumer, but in an enterprise environment, you really need to know what's on users' devices before you start letting them in to the Active Directory, to email, to the VPN, to corporate resources. When you take a look at the overall threat landscape, however, between iOS and Android, there are many things that are the same. There are a few differences, but many threats are very much the same for enterprises. Now, famously, in the last week or two, Tim Cook, CEO at Apple, has come out and lambasted the Android platform for being a real security mess. Mr. Cook quoted ZDNet's Adrian Kingsley Hughes and said, "Android fragmentation is turning devices into a toxic hellstew of vulnerabilities." Mr. Cook said that at the Apple Developer Conference. While it is true that there are over 11,000 different variants of Android when you factor it by hardware manufacturer and operating system version and patch level, and you can find a really interesting graph of that OpenSignal.com has published. We include OpenSignal's great visualization of the Android fragmentation problem in the June report. And what that means is that all of these different versions of Android may have different levels of security fixes, different types of vulnerabilities. They may have been misconfigured by the manufacturer or by the distributor of the device. So there is some truth that older versions of Android in the broader perspective may not necessarily be as secure as the latest version. And in general, on the iOS platform, people are prompted more often to update, so they move over to the latest version of iOS generally more quickly than people move over to the newest version of Android. So there is some amount of fragmentation that can expose users on older devices to different security threats that may have been patched in the last year and they're running a 1 or 2 year old version of Android. However, let's take a look at the threats that are very similar across both platforms. Enterprise users, and consumers of course as well, of both iOS devices and Android devices are equally exposed to phishing, spear phishing, which of course is the way that almost every advanced persistent threat that has been recorded or published has been initiated, is through spear phishing of very targeted employees, and we'll get to that risk in a minute. SMS phishing, so phish messages being delivered through the messaging channel, and app phishing. apps which take users to websites, and those websites can present hostile content. For example, the Netflix malware, that was an app phishing attack, which was basically taking users to a website. And of course, as we start moving to more HTML5 apps, control over app content, control over app updates gets lost to some extent because you can change them all the time. So an app that may get through a review on an app store and look perfectly great may 3 weeks later be compromised by attackers, or may have even been set up by attackers in the first place to create an app phishing attack. Users of both iOS and Android need to be making sure that all email feeds that they're getting are coming through good spam and anti-phishing filters. We all know that they're not 100%, and particularly for spear phishing, they're not. So our recommendation is that users also run through VPNs all the time, whether it's a corporate VPN or a VPN service that has security capabilities in it to block access to known phishing or suspected spear phishing sites. Both iOS and Android, in our analysis, are equally vulnerable to mining of the corporate address book. When a user brings their device into work and it's connected up to Active Directory to get the contact database and email from the company, an app can come in there and start mining that data and then sending it off the device. Now, you can imagine there are plenty of apps out there that do this that are legitimate. They're free texting apps or social networking apps or job hunting apps, free phone call apps. But there are also apps that don't need to be using that data, and what they're doing is they're pulling it off for monetization purposes, so taking that data and selling it on the back end. And there are hostile apps that are designed to just steal that data off users' devices. And while it might be fine if your 16-year-old daughter's phone has her contact database slurped off, that's not so good when it's connected to Active Directory, because you've now just exposed every person in the organization's information. The other thing is, even if that's being sent to a legitimate company, a legitimate app developer site, you have no control over how that data is being stored. Is it being encrypted? Is it being resold? Have they been hacked and that data been stolen? So you've basically just created a much broader attack surface against your company and your employees by letting that address book information get pulled off of your device. And we talked about this in the last podcast as well. One difference we did find when we looked across iOS and Android is that Android does have some more vulnerability in that apps can scan your SMS records and send them off your device, and also scan your phone call logs and send them off your device. So now if you think about an employee inside of your company having their address book, all the phone call logs, all the SMS traffic pulled off the device, you've now basically exposed everything you need to use that employee as a target in advanced persistent threat. And the attack may not come through the mobile device. That attack may be a targeted email sent to that employee, spoofing to be from another employee inside of your network. They know that those employees communicate because they've seen their SMS messages or their phone call logs, and you can create a very nice targeted APT, which may infect someone on their device, or it may infect them on their work computer, or it may be encouraging them to install a different app. It may be a phishing attack, a very targeted spear phishing attack to that employee. Both iOS and Android are susceptible to jailbreaking and rooting and what we call jammers. And jammers are tools that attempt to hide from security products and MDM, mobile device management products, and content management products, the fact that that phone is jailbroken or rooted. Some examples of jammers for both jailbreak and rooting are the old favorite XCon, but also Officer, TS Protector, Root Cloak, and Hide My Root. But we have to remember that apps can also compile in their own jammer code without having to rely on standalone jammers and it's pretty tricky to detect those. On the iOS platform, sometimes you have to wait a month or two after a new version of the operating system comes out before a jailbreak tool is available, but typically either the current version or one version back is easily jailbroken. On Android, there are of course a similar problem with rooting. In fact, yesterday, June 19th, a new vulnerability called Towel Root was released, and it uses privilege escalation vulnerability in the Linux kernel that is at the heart of Android to allow any app to escalate its privileges to root and take over the device. That vulnerability is CVE 2014-3153. Now let's talk about SSL vulnerabilities. In particular, the biggest vulnerability we've seen in the last few months has been the Heartbleed problem, where the new version of OpenSSL was released and it has a problem where you can effectively, an attacker can connect to a server and through buffer overflows and timing issues can pull out running state information, which might include private keys or other user sessions information. Now you might ask, why is that a problem on a mobile device, on an Android or an iPhone? Well, it's a problem because both platforms allow apps to compile in OpenSSL. You're not compelled to use the version in the OS. In fact, those versions can have these problems as well, by the way. But when an app can be connected to another server, that server can effectively exploit the Heartbleed bug back on the app and then extract state and other information out of the app. Think about if that app can be man-in-the-middle through a Wi-Fi network. It's going to the wrong site. It's trying to establish SSL. You can basically attack the app that way. So both platforms and apps on platforms are vulnerable to Heartbleed attacks against the apps running on the iPhone, running on iPad, running on Android, and need to be updated. Next, I'd like to talk about a vulnerability that's unique to the iOS platform, and that's hostile configuration profiles. So iOS has more extensive mobile device management capabilities built into it than the Android platform does. And a lot of that is done through a configuration profile. And there's different types of configuration profiles: VPN profiles, general config profiles, MDM config profiles. These can be installed by simply visiting a website. So the attack is as follows. You send an email to a user or an SMS, or you even trick them just from a hostile advertisement on a website, or anyway, you get them to visit a website. And then if they click on it, they're presented with a hostile configuration profile. If they have a password set on their device, they have to type in their password, but this, of course, can be easily social engineered by sending them an email saying that there's a security update to your operating system from corporate IT. Please install this profile so that we update your VPN, for example. And of course, sending those emails is very easy if you have the address book which you mined from your hostile app. Nevertheless, when they visit that site, they get the profile installed. Now that profile can modify VPN settings. It can install certificates, which then would allow a malicious Wi-Fi or malicious VPN to do man-in-the-middle attacks. It can also tamper with pre-installed apps from Apple. So we have a live proof of concept up and running where if you visit the site, you visit the web page, it goes and installs the profile. We basically replace the iTunes on your device with a fake iTunes. It's really a link to a web page, but it looks just like iTunes. And from there, you can do things like ask the user for their name and password to re-authenticate into iTunes. Well, why is that a problem? Well, now you've got their username and password to at least one service, which again can be used in an APT because users, as we all know, often reuse passwords. But the other thing it does is it now gives the attacker the ability to do what I call backup hijacking. They now have the credentials to log into your cloud-based backup on iTunes in the iCloud. If you've been backing up your device, they can now recover all the data off your device. They've basically copied and cloned your device. Both operating systems are vulnerable to backup hijacking, but this is a specific example which ties into a very specific iOS vulnerability around hostile configuration profiles. And one of the things that your security software needs to be doing is scanning for hostile profiles or profile changes on devices that are connected to your network and looking to see if those might be hostile, if they're changing VPN settings or what have you. Because profiles shouldn't change very often, and if they do change, it's an indication of an attack. Now, we've seen recently, in the recent weeks, the return of ransomware. So people have been porting ransomware onto Android. There's been some new ports recently. These effectively encrypt your device and then demand money, whether in Western Union payments, PayPal, or Bitcoin, to unlock your device and decrypt your device. There was a very interesting one targeted against iPhone and iPad users recently in Australia. And what they were doing was taking over users' iTunes accounts and then locking out their devices, changing the passwords on iTunes, and then ransoming control back and saying, well, we're going to delete your device unless you pay us. So both platforms have a ransomware problem that is growing and is purely financially motivated. They go through different attack vectors, though. The final section of the June Marble Security Mobile Threat Report looks at the analysis of apps across Android and across iOS and looks for which categories of apps have the most variability in risky behavior. What we did was we normalized app categories into 18 categories that are common across iOS and Android. And an app category would be things like a social networking app, or a photo and video app, health and fitness apps, entertainment apps, travel apps, that type of thing. You can see it in the report. And so we normalized the categories and did our dynamic analysis of what apps are actually doing, what their behavior is, where they're communicating to, what type of data they're exfiltrating off devices. And then we look at which app categories, what percent of apps in there have a greater than 2 standard deviations of risk over the norm for the entire platform, for the entire OS. And on Android, we found that social networking was the worst. That about 17% of the apps in the social networking category have a relatively high degree of risky behavior, meaning mining information about the device, about the user, potentially accessing online accounts, exfiltrating data off the device. And the next most risky category were productivity apps. Now, if we look at it on iOS, it's a little different. Games had the highest concentration of riskier apps than all other apps on the iOS platform. And it was about almost 15% of games on iOS have much higher risky behavior than the general iOS app. And the next most risky category were news applications, because they're trying to monetize the content by effectively taking all the data they can off your device about you, your contacts, etc. Using that information in your contact database, for example, to spam your contacts. So take a look at that in the Mobile Threat Report. You can find it for free at www.marblesecurity.com. The final thing I'll mention before we wrap up is that there's a disturbing trend out there for app developers to compile in third-party libraries that they know nothing about. Now, there are plenty of third-party libraries from reputable companies where they might be an app performance monitoring library, might be a graphics library. There are some, if you would call them, reputable advertising libraries, but there's also advertising libraries that are really we don't know the provenance of, and developers are not going to review the code bases. They're often just compiling them in, and they don't know what that library does. So it's important to have, in an enterprise context, an analysis of the apps on your users' devices, the riskiness of those apps, and be able to make decisions in an automated fashion if risky apps are found that can expose corporate data and expose the company to APTs. Those need to be shut down. Users need to be notified. They need to be kicked off of the active sync. They need to be kicked off the VPN and the Wi-Fi until they get rid of those apps. And then it's safe to use those devices in a BYOD scenario. Well, that's it for the June 2014 Marble Security podcast. I look forward to talking with you next time when we plan to investigate publisher reputations of hundreds of thousands of apps. So long for now.